I'm Heidi Hess. I'm one of the co-directors of CREDO Action, and I am so excited to be here this afternoon with Sabeel Rahman, the president of Dēmos. Dēmos is a think and do tank that is powering the movement for a just, inclusive, and multiracial democracy. Sabeel is also a law professor and an author. Today is a day when his book, Democracy Against Domination, seems like an incredibly important read for all of us. Many days in the last couple of years, but especially a day like today. So I'm super excited to dig in and be in conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Heidi, and thank you, CREDO Action, for having us. It's a real thrill. I was telling some of you as we were getting organized here that one of the great things about being in this work is meeting the people who make change possible. And it's really a pleasure to get to be with you all and talk about this crazy moment that we're in for our democracy.
Yeah. Well, first, not a lot of think and do tanks out there, so can you tell us what that means?
So we, Dēmos and Dēmos Action, we think of ourselves as a think and do tank. And so to step back for a second, if we think about, how does change happen in the world? And it's not enough to just have a great idea or a great policy, right? You actually need power to make change happen. And you also need to test drive things, right? We need to get some versions of the change we want to have happen in the world, in the states, in small baby steps, through campaigns, through litigation, right? And so for us, we're really trying to use all of the tools, our campaigns work, our partnerships with grassroots partners, our litigation work, to drive a longer term agenda of structural reform. Because it's not enough to just have the idea, we actually have to try to make it real.
Yeah, so can you just flesh that out a little bit and just tell us about some of your more recent campaigns?
Yeah, so a couple of examples. So one is, we're headquartered in New York. The last couple of years and change, we've been working in close coalition with the New York Renews Coalition to drive a climate equity bill in New York State. And all credit to the coalition, a tremendous, tremendous job by a lot of grassroots folks to drive that through. But our role there was really a couple of things. One is using our think tank side of the shop, really doing a lot of the policy design, and we're proud of how the bill that passed centers frontline communities, puts a lot more investment into frontline communities that are most affected by climate change, but also proposes a governance structure in the bureaucracy that directly empowers those communities so that they actually have a seat at the table. So we're doing the policy work, but we also were really closely working with the coalition on strategy, on kind of moving things across the finish line. And now that the campaign is done, we'll be writing up some of those lessons learned to sort of share that back out with the field of how do you actually do a campaign that centers racial equity, centers communities of color as a matter of campaigns and as a matter of policy, right? Because both of those things need to happen if we're serious about racial equity and democracy.
Yeah.
One more example that I'll mention, we do a ton of democracy work and work on voter suppression. And a few of you might remember back in December, the Texas Secretary of State made this false claim about thousands of illegal voter registrants on the rolls. And of course, it was, the claim was voter fraud, but it was a voter suppression tactic, right, to intimidate voters of color. So we filed suit we brought suit in Texas, but we also worked closely with MALDEF and with Texas Organizing Project as part of a larger push to not just win the lawsuit, which we did, but also win the argument. And so the narrative really became one about voter suppression, not voter fraud, and the Secretary of State had to step down in May. And so it's just a good example for us about how, lots of folks worked hard on that, but we're in such a street fight for our democracy right now that you really need all the tools on the table. And so to be part of an organization that can marry the policy to the action really makes a big difference for us.
Yeah. So one of the things you mentioned in talking about your New York work is working with lots of frontline groups. Mm-hmm. So I wanted one of the projects that I feel super inspired by that you're working on, and I think that it was part of the CREDO funding that came, or CREDO funding that we're looking at, is the Inclusive Democracy Project. Yeah. Great. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah,
and then I might have follow-up questions too.
Yes, totally. No, and we're super appreciate the support, and we're really excited about our Inclusive Democracy Project. So the IDP is a cohort of about 30 to 40 base building groups that are working in communities of color with predominantly women of color leaders across over a dozen states. And we've been working with these groups in close partnership for a number of years. And the basic idea is, look, if we want to drive structural democracy reform in the states, you have to build the power to do that. And to build that power, you actually have to create a space that allows communities of color and leaders of color to step back and share ideas, talk strategy, compare notes, and to have the support that we as a national think tank can bring in terms of policy, in terms of communications, in terms of coordinating with our litigation work and our other tools. The thing that we've learned from doing that work is pretty important, I think, for the democracy reform community. One is that centering race and racial equity is not just morally critical, we actually believe it's a winning strategy, meaning that you can't win democracy reform without centering communities of color, building power in communities of color, and driving democracy reforms that connect directly to the lived experience of economic and racial justice that communities are feeling. So you can't just come in and talk about automatic voter registration, because by itself that may not mean a lot to folks. But if you come in and you're talking about the crisis of affordable housing in New York, as one of our partners, CVH, works on, or the crises of climate equity, and why can't we solve those problems? Well, it's because of money in politics. It's because of voter suppression. It's because of gerrymandering. Right now, you're cooking, because now democracy is actually serving the kind of emancipation and freedom and real change that folks need. And this is all stuff that we wouldn't know but for the brilliance of our partners. And so having something like IDP be sort of a touchstone for us as well as for the cohort has really made a big difference in our work.
And are there particular democracy reforms that are sort of coming out as high priority for those groups to be working on? I mean, you mentioned automatic voter registration.
Yeah, sure. So some of them will be familiar to folks, right? You kind of think your standard structural democracy reform agenda of, voting rights, voter registration, redistricting reform, money in politics are all pretty central. And, we've been really proud to work with groups all over the country, in New Mexico and Florida and New York and Michigan and Washington, D.C. to drive some of these campaign wins, policy changes, which have been really great. A number of money in politics campaigns, for example, at the state and local level. But one of the things we're actually pretty excited about in the next few months, we'll actually be releasing a couple of reports, what we're calling the Inclusive Democracy Agenda. And this is something that we co-created with our IDP partners. When we convened them last spring, we actually put the question to them of stepping back, if we take the long view over the next 20 to 30 years, what would it take to build real power in your communities that gets us out of playing defense all the time and actually has us being real co-equals in our democracy? And that opened up a whole bunch of amazing ideas, including things that a lot of folks were working on. And so we've been sort of working with that to try to add some new things to the national democracy reform conversation. And so, this could include everything from things like participatory budgeting to, if you're talking about affordable housing or zoning, who's actually on the zoning commission? Does it actually represent, and is it actually accountable to working families and communities of color? And, most of the time the answer is no, right? But that's democracy too, is my point. Right? And I think we're used to thinking about democracy reform as its traditional list of things, and that's critical. But to really make it real, we have to also connect it to some of these other issues.
Yep. So speaking of 30-year vision and structural change, one of the goals of Dēmos, and especially the Inclusive Democracy Project, is to affirm multiracial prosperity, cross-racial unity, and a government for all. Again, today is a day where my whole entire brain has been focused on what we're fighting against, and it can be hard sometimes to find the time to step back and think about what we're for. So I'm curious, how do you guys talk about that, about what we're for, instead of just what we're fighting against?
Totally. And I think we're so conditioned to be playing defense. It's such an important question. So a way that we've been thinking about it, right, for us at Dēmos Action and at Dēmos, if you step back and think, our goal coming out of this moment of crisis can't just be to restore the way things were 4 years ago, right? Because it wasn't that great to begin with. Really, our aspiration, our North Star, has to be nothing short of emancipation. And I mean that word in the fullest sense, as in liberation from the kind of structural racism that keeps communities of color down, from the kinds of economic power that maintains a system of exploitation and extraction, and from the kinds of hoarding of political power that makes democracy a sham. And that is not the freedom of, kind of the free market of, Milton Friedman, right?
No.
It's a much deeper, richer notion of liberation. Now, with that as a North Star, that then opens up a lot more, right? Because it becomes really clear then that it's not enough to just do democracy reform without racial equity. And it's not enough to just do democracy and racial equity without also tackling economic power. That these are all aspects of the same thing, which is that those things that keep us from being free. And that's that obviously encompasses a lot more than what we as one organization can do. But in terms of what gets me up in the morning and thinking about what we can accomplish coming out of this moment, we feel, I think, understandably, a sense of crisis. But I also often talk about how this is a moment of radical openness, in the sense that we are open to some really terrifying possibilities, right? The resurgence of open white nationalism and new forms of corporate power. But it also means that we're open to new, bolder visions of our democracy that were not on the table 5 years ago, right? That even in sort of liberal policy circles, what passed for good reform 5 years ago was not really great.
Right.
And so the fact that we can actually talk about this stuff now in a much more central way is a pretty significant thing. And so I think it's just helpful for me anyway, if we try to remember, this bigger North Star, it's a thing that we can dare to dream at this point because of just how crazily chaotic the world is.
Yeah. We were in the context of impeachment the other day talking with some partners, and someone was making the point that, some of the sort of impulse that I think is sort of moderating the Democratic Party is like, we just want things to calm back down.
Totally.
Right? And but it's so important, right, to be able to articulate a vision that's a vision for the future that is actually a better calm than the calm we had before, right?
Yeah.
Or the calm we had before, right? So it feels like what you're talking about is part of that too, right? That we're actually putting out that it's not a world where people can so easily be made anxious about economic instability or, where immigrants can be thrown under the bus, but that we're really articulating what the future could look like where we all can be free.
Right, and I totally agree, Heidi. And speaking as Dēmos Action, it's important for us to remember too, right, that we didn't just get to this point because of stuff that the right did.
That's right.
I mean, they did stuff, right, and it's a big part of why we're in the mess that we're in. But we are coming off of the heels of a 30 to 40 year stretch of time where even a lot of liberals were operating under a conservative worldview, where economic reform really was about nibbling around the edges to make the market work a little better. And democracy reform was really about good governance. Let's make things more open and transparent, but we're not really going to think about how to radically shift power to communities of color and to working families, right? And that was a left end, or not a left and a right thing, but a right, center, and liberal thing that maintained the state of affairs for a long time. And so when we think about what we're trying to build towards, it's really about that vision and building the power for a multiracial populism that can transform the country but also transform the party.
Right. Yeah, and it's like being able to support the politicians who are willing to go there right now and build the pipeline. I mean, that seems like part of the pipeline never got built for that because that wasn't the vision of the party, right? And so there's so much work to do to really like cultivate those folks and shift that. I mean, we're still, so often is, but we'll lose seats or we won't have moderate voters. It's like, oh my gosh. What are the risks we're willing to take for the world that we want? Right. And we have to keep taking that.
Yeah, I love the way you put that, sort of the risk we're willing to take for the world that we want. When you take a long-term view, taking a long-term view doesn't mean you ignore the crises of the moment. It actually means you take them more seriously, right? Because it means that you have to use the crisis of the moment in a way that actually gets you out of the crisis in the long term. If you're just playing triage all the time, you actually end up on the back foot forever. And so I feel like a lot of times what happens in sort of conventional liberal policy debates, right, is we're just trying to solve the immediate problem before us, and so then we are afraid to take risks, right, because we're afraid of the seats we might lose, or we're afraid of the voters we might lose. And so we moderate our own positions. But that's actually self-defeating in the long run. And so taking the long run means thinking about the bold ideas, thinking about the pipeline, thinking about doing our work in ways that builds grassroots power that can hold folks accountable and make demands even after the next election. So one thing that I'll often ask people is when we're talking to people who don't necessarily think in terms of movement building the way CREDO does or Dēmos Action does, is it think about the day after the election, and what is the power that is left and the capacity that is left after everyone goes home, the day after, right? And if you're not actually walking away from an election or a campaign with more power than you had when you started, then you haven't done it right. And so when we work with our partners in the IDP or when we do our policy work, we're trying to think about kind of holding ourselves to that standard of fueling the longer term movement.
Yep. And so different than the notion that communities of color are just sort of transactionally engaged as for votes versus we're actually going to build the power of the organizations that are going to hold the local electeds all the way up accountable for what they promised and support the community in understanding what it needs and demanding more and more, which is just that's why I love the Inclusive Democracy Project, right? Because it's those groups that are going to be building for the power we hopefully have in 20
and
and
2040.
Beyond, and 40 and 50.
And by the way, that also means centering the power of communities of color and leaders of color, even in our own spaces, right? It's so easy to skip over these groups in a national coalition or in funders will not always kind of fund the base building groups who are doing the work. And so we progressives have to take our own values seriously in how we do our work.
I'm curious, so if you think about these narratives about the world we want, these freedom narratives, how do progressives in this room, on Facebook, or who engage with CREDO in all kinds of ways, what are the ways we talk into that future, right? So versus sort of talking in the street fight or in the enemy frame. Like, how do you think about that?
And is the question sort of like how do we set up?
I mean, I just think like for folks who are saying like, yes, I want to think about the future and not always be in the moment of the fight, but what does that mean about, I don't know, how I talk to my friends about the news, or what does that mean about how I post on Facebook, or what I elevate in my sort of circles of conversation about politics or the world? What does it look like to be in that kind of conversation versus I feel like the one that it's just so easy to be in all the time?
That's really helpful. So one thing that I often think about, right, is that there is usually a power behind the villain that we're most familiar with. So it's not to downplay the villainy of our current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Ave, which is a lot, but it's not just one person who happened to roll into the office and do a bunch of crazy stuff, right? There are actual interest groups who profit from the state of affairs, right? And that's true whether you're talking about big money donors. It's true whether you're talking about the financial sector, predatory lenders, and the way private equity has stripped cities and communities of color of their wealth. There is a power behind the scenes. And so when we're responding to the crisis, even as we're talking about it and thinking about it, I think the more we can connect the dots between what is happening right now and what's going on under the surface to help our friends and those of us around us to actually sort of see that, it's a bigger fight. And in fact, if we focus our efforts on those sources of power that make other bad stuff possible, we can actually have a bigger impact, right? And which is why stuff like money in politics is so critical, and why corporate power is so critical, right? There's an engine behind the crisis that we're in. And so I do think that's a muscle, right? That it's easy to think in terms of the immediate election or the immediate moment, but thinking in terms of these structural causes is a mental stretch, right? But it gets easier, right, as you get organized and have a way of thinking about this.
Yep. I want to go back to one thing that I know is a priority right now that we didn't talk about yet, because it seems like an idea that was radical not that long ago and then is not as radical now.
Yeah.
And as someone who I know has done a lot of thinking on the economic side of things, I'm just curious your take and sort of where it goes from here is eliminating student debt and debt-free college.
Yeah, great. No, we're it's a huge issue. We're really excited about the movement on this issue. So, you're totally right, Heidi. Going back a couple years, right, the idea of student debt and debt-free college and even debt forgiveness, right, was so not on the radar, even in, 2014, 2015. This is an issue that Dēmos has been working on for a long time, obviously with many others in the field and many other partners. But we were really excited to, start to help mainstream the idea of debt-free college in the 2016 election, getting that into the conversation. And then since then, have been doing a lot of work talking about how debt actually functions as a way to perpetuate racial injustice and to perpetuate economic insecurity. So through our research, one of the things we were able to show is that the precise moment that the student debt crisis ballooned is the same moment that public education, institutions of public education became more diverse and then became defunded. And it's a pretty clear moment in time. And so this narrative which was the narrative, 2-3 years ago, that either A, debt is not a problem because, you're a rational human and you entered into a contract and, whatever you want, right? Sort of standard free market view. Or B, because you are somehow being irrational or irresponsible, right? Students and their, millennials and their $10 avocado toast or whatever, actually like $15 in this town.
Yeah, it's true. Sorry.
As an older millennial, I can attest to all of this. But like that's not the story at all, right? Actually, the student debt crisis is a product of disinvestment in our public goods and an attempt to reassert racial hierarchy through who we allow access to those basic goods and services that people need. So we were able to help shift some of that narrative. And now in the current campaign, it's just the price of entry, right? And so like to be taken seriously in the Democratic primary, you have to have a view on student debt that is pretty close to, what Senator Sanders and Senator Warren are putting forward. And I say, by the way, we're also really proud of how Senator Warren's plan for student debt forgiveness really builds a lot on our research and work that we've been doing with her team for some time.
And are there current congressional champions of these bills that folks should know about and be lifting up?
There is a bill in the Congress that was introduced a couple months ago, sort of a variation on the Warren plan, which is moving. And we're actually, one of our areas of focus in these next 18 months is to work with a couple of key states to help drive some race-forward debt forgiveness campaigns in the states where we can kind of pilot the proof of concept, right, and just keep moving the ball forward.
Yeah. I mean, so much institutionalized racism in those stories about who has debt and why there's debt. And so undoing that as part of those campaigns, I'm sure, is a big piece of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, changing the narrative around it, right? Look, debt is not about responsibility. Debt is about power. That is about power, and it's about race, and it's about extraction. And that's a different way of thinking about what is going on here. It's that one of those unmasking moments, right? That something that seems like a normal market transaction under the conservative worldview and the conventional worldview is actually just another exercise of power that, has no place in a democratic society.
Right. A couple more questions. Well, another thing that you guys work on is re-enfranchisement. And so again, I think a place where narratives about merit, narratives about worth and mistakes and punishment really play in. So I'm just thinking that might be another one that could be, I'm curious to hear sort of how you guys think about it and where you think you're moving those narratives.
Yep. No, this is
And maybe
great.
you can explain re-enfranchisement just as a starting point.
Totally. So, as many of you might be familiar, huge sea change in our voting rights landscape last November, when Florida passed a state constitutional amendment, Amendment 4, to restore voting rights for the formerly incarcerated folks. This was a huge win, and really driven by the brilliance of leaders on the ground, folks like Desmond Meade and Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. Again, another one of those ideas that, not that long ago was not at all taken seriously, right? And not resourced right, and we were proud to kind of be in allyship with Desmond on that. So we now have a conversation about how we restore voting rights for folks when they return from having served time. With this next wave of work on this issue, what we're hoping to take on is the idea that, well, why should someone's voting rights be stripped away in the first place? Like, what is that about, really? If you go back, right, it's actually not it's the same actually story as the student debt story. The whole reason why we have restrictions on the right to vote is a direct response to the expansion of voting rights after the Civil War. Right? We passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. I'm a con law professor by background, so I can't resist. We passed these Reconstruction Amendments in the 1860s and 1870s, and right away, that's exactly the moment where the states start to pass new laws to criminalize different, vagrancy laws, like things that the local police could use disproportionately to target black communities. And that's when they start building new prisons, and that's when they start putting into place new restrictions on who can register to vote, right? And Supreme Court then validates all of this in a series of decisions that are super problematic. So we're trying to take on like the heart of the issue. And this is one of those things that, when you take the long-term view, it's exactly the right thing to do, right? Because in the short-term view, it's like, oh, well, is that too much, right? And I get that. But if we leave it to the side, it remains as something that can be weaponized against us, right, and against communities of color. Because so long as that restriction remains, it's just a matter of time, and until somebody brings it back. And we're seeing already the attempts to dismantle Amendment 4 in Florida and elsewhere is a good example of that. And so our thought is, okay, we're going to keep moving, a lot of the democracy reforms that are mainstream. But here's an idea that is not mainstream right now, but that if we can tackle this, if we can turn the narrative around, if we can win some proofs of concept, bring our legal tools to bear to start changing the case law and winning some cases, all of that together, fast forward 4 or 5 years from now, if we can move the needle, then it just opens up a lot more in terms of who's able to vote and how we can prevent the types of voter suppression tactics that keep getting thrown against communities of color.
Yep. Which makes me think that I don't have my question fully baked, but let's talk about the courts for a second, because litigation is part of what you do. And, we crossed the 160, I think, confirmations for Trump recently. Mostly white, mostly young men. What do you think the consequences of that are going to be without, I don't know, totally crushing my spirit, although that's kind of how I already am. And then sort of what is Demo, like, what do you feel like is the right leverage for the progressive movement around judges right now, given where we are?
It's really hard, right? I mean, if not to depress
It's fine. I mean, I know that
it's super depressing. I mean, look,
the bar's low for my spirit already.
I mean, look, we're in a moment where the reality is, look, the courts are the most are sort of the crown jewel in our constitutional system's like array of minoritarian, anti-majoritarian, power hoarding techniques, right? Between the Senate, the Electoral College, and the courts, like we actually have a constitution that was designed to frustrate democracy. And we're in a moment where you have had multiple presidents from the right who have won despite losing the popular vote, who have appointed the majority of judges who have lifetime tenure. That's just a fact.
Yep.
So it's a big problem, obviously. A couple things I'll say about this. I think in terms of the impact, right, it's not just the demographic impact that's a big part of it. These are judges, especially in these last few years, who will not even say on the record that Brown v. Board is correctly decided. And so that's the level of zealotry that the courts are being stacked with. So, this is something that I think a lot of us who are in the voting rights and civil rights and racial justice world spend a lot of time really fretting about. It's like, what do you do when the federal judiciary is, I don't want to say entirely lost, but it's, it's not really, this is not the judiciary of 1964 when you passed the Civil Rights Act and, we had an image of using the courts to enforce voting rights. So there are a couple of things that I think progressives need to think about. One is, again, taking this long-term view, we've got to think about the pipeline, to your point. What are the waves of talent, and not just, star lawyers from the corporate world, but, who are grassroots movement leaders, who are public defenders, who are people who are doing work in the communities who actually should be judges, right?
Yep.
We want a judiciary that looks like us. It also means, by the way, that at the state level, we need to be paying more attention to state judicial elections. In the 2018 election, when we had this great blue wave, that blue wave did not reach, for example, the Michigan Supreme Court, which was swingable. And it did not reach the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And what were two states where the GOP then had these crazy unconstitutional power grabs after the election? Michigan and Wisconsin. So we have to take those races seriously, and they're often forgotten. So that's the second thing. And then the last thing I'd say about the judiciary is, like, look, at a certain point, we have to get out of the sort of hero worship about the courts. And I say that as a law professor. Like, you come into law school, the first thing you learn about is Marbury v. Madison and Brown v. Board, and the court as this, rational place of deliberation about, what freedom and equality means. And that, we have amazing jurists in our history and some amazing folks on the bench, obviously. But, if you believe in democracy, that means we should be putting our faith in the people and in elections and in legislatures. And we just, at a certain point, we're not going to get very far by just focusing on, 9 unelected folks in D.C.
Yep. That's good. See, we can move it to the people, we can lose the courts, and that doesn't mean that it's done, right? It just means that we have to rethink the way we think about power.
Yeah, totally. And look, the way that we shouldn't accept any of our institutions as set in stone, because they're not.
Right.
And the truth is that our judiciary has gone through many changes over time, precisely to try to make it more democratically responsive and to dislodge concentrations of unaccountable power. Every couple of decades, we go through a period where we try to remake our institutions. The courts are no exception. We're in one of those moments now, right? And so whether it's democracy reform, H.R. 1, the courts, everything is up for grabs. And so, let's be bold, right? And let's actually go and get the things that we actually want, and not just be in a defensive crouch all the time.
And that's how we should close, because let's go get what we want. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Thanks everybody for watching. And that's it. See you guys next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, CREDO.
Thank you. And then sometimes we awkwardly sit here as Facebook finishes. We're like, hi.